The hallways of Westlake High School were buzzing with the usual Monday morning chaos. Students slammed lockers, laughed too loudly, and rushed to beat the bell. In the middle of this teenage hurricane stood Andrew Wilson, clutching his schedule and trying to make sense of the building layout. It was his first day, and already he felt like he had a target on his back. Room 237. Should be around here somewhere, Andrew mumbled to himself. At 16, he was tall for his age, with thoughtful eyes that took everything in. His mom had warned him that moving mid-semester would be tough, but there wasn't much choice after she got the university job offer. A better salary meant better opportunities for both of them, even if it meant leaving their old neighborhood behind. Andrew finally found his first class and slipped into an empty seat at the back. He could feel curious eyes on him, sizing him up as the only black student in the room. He'd been in mostly black and Latino schools before, and this wealthy suburban setting felt like landing on another planet. "I'm Mrs. Peterson," the teacher announced, barely glancing at Andrew. "We have a new student joining us today. You can introduce yourself later. Now let's continue with our discussion of quadratic equations." The morning passed in a blur of new faces and half smiles. By lunchtime, Andrew had figured out the school's social map. The athletes clustered near the vending machines. The drama kids claimed the tables near the stage door, and the wealthy kids, led by a tall guy named Blake, held court at the center tables like they owned the place. Andrew found an empty spot at a side table and pulled out his lunch. He also took out his notebook to review some coding ideas he'd been working on. His fingers tapped quietly on the table as he worked through an algorithm in his head. "What's that?" "Writing poetry." The voice came from above him, dripping with mockery. Blake stood there, flanked by two other guys in identical designer hoodies. "Just some coding stuff," Andrew replied, keeping his voice neutral. He'd dealt with guys like this before. "Coding?" Blake raised his eyebrows dramatically. "Well, excuse us, Mr. Silicon Valley." His friends snickered on cue. "Didn't know we had a genius in our midst." "I'm not a genius, just interested in computers," Andrew said, closing his notebook. "Yeah? Well, we're interested in knowing why you picked our school," said one of Blake's friends, leaning in too close. "Isn't there a school in your own neighborhood?" Andrew felt his jaw tighten but kept his expression calm. "This is my neighborhood now. My mom teaches at the university." "Oh, affirmative action hire?" Blake asked with fake innocence, just quietly enough that nearby teachers couldn't hear. The words stung, but Andrew had promised his mom he'd stay out of trouble. "She's the new head of computer science, actually," he said, standing up and gathering his things. "I should get to my next class." As he walked away, he heard one of them call out, "Running already? We're just being friendly." The afternoon dragged on with similar moments. A whispered comment here, a blocked path there. In gym class, someone accidentally knocked his clothes into the shower. By final period, Andrew sat in the back of his history class, feeling completely alone and fighting the anger building inside him. When the teacher assigned group projects, no one made eye contact with him. The teacher finally placed him with two girls who didn't bother hiding their annoyance. "Just show up with your part done," one of them said, passing him a slip of paper with the assignment details. "We'll handle the presentation." On the bus ride home, Andrew stared out the window at the passing neighborhoods. His dad had always told him that education was the one thing nobody could take away from you. Before he died 3 years ago, he'd made Andrew promise to excel no matter what. "Your mind is your superpower," he used to say. Andrew took a deep breath. This wasn't his first challenge, and it wouldn't be his last. What these kids didn't know was that Andrew wasn't just another new student, he was a state chess champion. He'd built a functioning AI assistant when he was 14. And most importantly, his father had been a lawyer who taught him to document everything and play the long game. As the bus pulled up to his stop, Andrew made a decision. He pulled out his phone and created a new note titled Westlake Records and made his first entry, complete with names, times, and exact quotes. These people had no idea who they were dealing with. And soon enough, they'd be the ones learning a lesson. Andrew stepped through his front door and dropped his backpack with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. The smell of his mom's cooking filled the apartment, bringing a small comfort after a rough first day. "How'd it go?" Dr. Wilson called from the kitchen. She appeared in the doorway, dish towel in hand, her professional clothes replaced by a comfortable t-shirt with their old university's logo. "About what I expected," Andrew said, trying to sound casual. He didn't want to worry her. She had enough on her plate, starting a new job at the university while single-handedly raising him since Dad died. "That bad, huh?" She wasn't fooled. She never was. "Come eat and tell me everything." Over dinner, Andrew gave her the highlights, carefully editing out the worst parts. His mom watched him with those eyes that seemed to see right through him, just like Dads used to do. "You know, your father didn't win his first civil rights case by hiding from the truth," she said gently. "Whatever's happening, we face it head-on." Andrew nodded, pushing rice around his plate. "It's nothing I can't handle." Later, in his bedroom, Andrew opened his laptop and found himself staring at a photo of his dad standing on the courthouse steps, fist raised in victory after winning a major discrimination case against the city. The photo sat next to his most prized possession, the chess trophy he'd won at the state championship last year. His phone buzzed with a text from his old friend Trey, surviving the suburbs. Andrew smiled for the first time that day and typed back, "Barely. These kids have never met anyone who doesn't summer in the Hamptons." "They're lost," Trey replied. "Remember what your dad always said." Andrew typed the words from memory. "Excellence is the best revenge." The next morning, Andrew arrived at school early. He'd woken up with a plan. Instead of trying to blend in, he would focus on finding his people, if they existed at this school. He wandered the quiet halls until he noticed a small classroom with the lights on. Through the window, he saw a few students huddled around what looked like a half-built robot. Curious, he pushed the door open. "Can I help you?" asked an older teacher with wild gray hair and coffee-stained khakis. "I was just looking around," Andrew said, his eyes fixed on the robot. "That's a really inefficient motor setup." The room went quiet. A girl with bright purple streaks in her hair looked up from the circuit board she was soldering. "And you would know because..." "I built something similar last year," Andrew said with a shrug. "If you adjust the gear ratio and reposition the weight distribution, you get about 30% more torque." The teacher raised an eyebrow and extended his hand. "I'm Mr. Reynolds, Robotics Club, and you're the new kid I've been hearing about." "Andrew Wilson," he replied, shaking the man's hand. "Prove it," said the girl with purple hair, gesturing toward the robot. Andrew smiled and pulled up a chair. For the next 20 minutes, he sketched out his ideas on scrap paper while the small group watched with growing interest. By the time the warning bell rang, he had drawn up a complete redesign. "That might actually work," admitted the girl, extending her hand. "I'm Zerb, by the way. Team captain." "We meet every Tuesday and Thursday after school," Mr. Reynolds said. "We could use someone with your brain." For the first time since arriving at Westlake, Andrew felt a small spark of hope. That spark was quickly extinguished in third period when he found "Go back where you came from" scrawled across his desk. He took a photo with his phone and added it to his growing documentation. At lunch, he spotted an empty seat at a side table and headed for it, only to find Blake's foot suddenly extended in his path. Andrew saw it coming and smoothly sidestepped, causing Blake to look foolish as he kicked at air. "Nice reflexes," called a voice from nearby. A boy with glasses waved him over. "You can sit with us." Andrew joined the small group, who introduced themselves as members of the school's chess club. When they learned he was a state champion, their eyes widened. "We've never made it past regionals," said the boy with glasses, who introduced himself as Louis. "Our school cares more about football than anything else." "Speaking of which," Zoe said, sliding into a seat beside them, "Blake and his buddies are watching you. They're not used to being ignored." Andrew glanced over and saw Blake's group huddled together, occasionally looking his way. "Let them watch," he said calmly. "I'm not here for them." That afternoon, Andrew stayed for the robotics meeting. The small group watched in amazement as he reprogrammed their robot's movements, explaining each step in a way that made the complex coding seem simple. As he waited for the bus afterward, Blake and two friends approached, surrounding him at the bus stop. "Think you're smart, don't you?" Blake said, standing too close. "Showing off with those nerds won't help you fit in here." Andrew met his gaze steadily. "I'm not trying to fit in. I'm trying to excel. There's a difference." "Is that what your daddy taught you?" One of Blake's friends sneered. A flash of pain crossed Andrew's face before he could hide it. "My father taught me a lot of things," he said quietly, "including how to recognize when someone's afraid of being outshined." The bus pulled up before things could escalate further. As Andrew found a seat, he pulled out his phone and added the confrontation to his notes. These records were becoming more than just documentation. They were his armor against whatever came next. At home that night, Andrew sat at his desk, a chessboard set up in front of him. He moved the pieces methodically, playing against himself, thinking several moves ahead, just like his dad had taught him. Sometimes, his father had told him once, "You have to sacrifice a pawn to win the game." Andrew moved his black knight across the board, capturing a white pawn. The real game at Westlake was just beginning, and Andrew Wilson was playing to win. 2 weeks passed, and Andrew settled into something like a routine. Mornings with the robotics team, classes spent keeping his head down, lunches with Louis and the chess club, and afternoons working on their competition robot. It wasn't perfect, but it was bearable. The robotics team had a regional competition coming up, and Andrew had completely redesigned their main project. Under his guidance, they'd transformed a clunky, barely functioning machine into a sleek robot capable of completing complex tasks. Even Mr. Reynolds was impressed. "We might actually have a shot this year," Zoe said, high-fiving Andrew after a successful test run. Her purple streaked hair was tied back, and she had a smudge of grease on her cheek. Blake and his crew were making bets on how badly we'd lose. "Blake's in the competition too?" Andrew asked, surprised. "His dad bought the team fancy equipment last year," Louis explained, joining them. "They came in third at regionals without doing any of the actual work. Their rich parents hired a college student to build it for them." Andrew shook his head. "That's not how this is supposed to work." "Welcome to Westlake," Zoe said, rolling her eyes, "where money buys everything." That afternoon, Andrew stayed late to fine-tune the robot's programming. The school was quiet, most students long gone. He was so focused on his work that he didn't hear the door open. "Working overtime, genius?" Blake's voice made Andrew jump. He wasn't alone. 3 of his friends stood behind him, blocking the doorway. "Just finishing up," Andrew said calmly, saving his work. He'd learned that showing fear only encouraged them. "The competition's next week, right?" Blake stepped closer, looking at the robot. "You actually think your junk heap can beat our team?" "It's not about the equipment," Andrew said. "It's about the engineering." "Right," Blake snorted. "Well, my dad says engineering is just buying the right stuff and paying the right people." He picked up a small component from the workbench. "Like this little thing. Looks expensive." "Put that down," Andrew said, standing up. "That's a custom-built sensor. We need it for the competition." Blake tossed it to one of his friends, who pretended to fumble it before catching it. "Oops, almost broke your toy." Andrew took a deep breath. "What do you want, Blake?" "Just checking out the competition," Blake said with a shrug. "Making sure everything's fair." The way he said fair made Andrew's skin crawl. There was a threat there, barely hidden. "The room has security cameras," Andrew lied, pointing to the ceiling corner. "Mr. Reynolds checks the footage every morning." Blake's smile faltered for a second, and he glanced up. The corner was dark, and there was no camera visible, but the doubt was enough. He nodded to his friend, who set the sensor back down. "See you at the competition," Blake said with a tight smile. "May the best team win." After they left, Andrew sat down, his hands shaking slightly. He pulled out his phone and added the encounter to his documentation, now a detailed record of 3 weeks of intimidation. That night at dinner, his mom noticed something was wrong. "You're pushing that food around, not eating it," she said. "What's on your mind?" Andrew considered brushing it off, but instead pulled out his phone and handed it to her. "I've been keeping track," he said quietly. Dr. Wilson scrolled through the notes, her expression darkening. "Andrew, why didn't you tell me it was this bad?" "I wanted to handle it myself." "There's handling it yourself, and then there's suffering alone," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "Your father would be the first to tell you that some battles need allies." She pulled out her own phone and scrolled through contacts. "Remember my friend Diane from law school? She specializes in cases like this now." "Mom, I don't want to make a big deal." "It already is a big deal," she interrupted. And if the school won't protect you, we need to be prepared. The next morning, Andrew approached Mr. Reynolds before robotics practice. I'm worried about the robot's security, he said. Blake and his friends were in here yesterday and they seemed interested in our project. Mr. Reynolds frowned. That boy's been trouble since freshman year. His father's on the school board, so he thinks he's untouchable. He thought for a moment. Let's move the robot to the storage closet when we're not working on it. I'll keep the key. But when they opened the classroom door, they knew they were too late. The robot lay in pieces on the floor, wires cut, components scattered. Someone had taken a screwdriver to the circuit boards, gouging deep scratches into the delicate electronics. What made Andrew's blood run cold was what they'd scratched into the main control panel, a crude racial slur followed by "Go home." Mr. Reynolds' face turned pale, then red with anger. I'm calling Principal Davis right now. The other team members arrived, their faces falling as they saw the destruction. Zoe knelt by the robot, lifting a mangled piece. 3 months of work, she whispered. The competition's in 5 days. Andrew took photos of everything, including the slur, before Mr. Reynolds could usher them out for the principal to investigate. His hands were steady now, his mind clear. This wasn't just about him anymore. Principal Davis arrived, looked around with a practiced, neutral expression, and sighed. Unfortunate. We'll look into it, but without witnesses. It's pretty obvious who did it, Mr. Reynolds said sharply. Accusations require evidence, Tom, the principal replied. We can't just point fingers at certain students because they've had issues in the past. There's a racial slur carved into our project, Andrew said, his voice quiet but firm. The principal glanced at him. And that's unacceptable, of course. We'll investigate thoroughly. But the way he said it made it clear nothing would happen. The robotics classroom had no security cameras, no witnesses would come forward, and Blake's father sat on the school board. That evening, Andrew sat at his desk, scrolling through the photos of the destroyed robot. His chess set was laid out beside his computer, a game in progress. His phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. This sucks. What do we do now? Before he could answer, his mom knocked on his bedroom door. Diane's on the phone, she said. She wants to talk to you about what's been happening. Andrew looked at the chessboard, at the pieces positioned for a trap several moves ahead. He thought about Blake's smug face, about the principal's empty promises, about the slur carved into their project. Tell her I'm ready to talk, Andrew said. It was time to stop playing defense. The real game was just beginning. The Wilson living room had turned into a war room. Diane Lee, his mom's friend from law school, sat across from Andrew, reading through his detailed notes with a professional calm that reminded him of his father. You've done an excellent job documenting everything, she said, looking up at him with approval. Most kids your age wouldn't think to keep records like this. My dad always said evidence speaks louder than emotions, Andrew replied, feeling a small glow of pride. The painful memory of his father was balanced by the satisfaction of following his example. Diane nodded. He was right. And these photos of the destroyed robot with that slur? She shook her head. That crosses several lines. Dr. Wilson brought in mugs of tea and set them on the coffee table. What are our options, Diane? We could file a formal complaint with the school board, Diane said, but with Blake's father sitting on it, that's tricky. We could go to the media, but that might make things harder for Andrew day to day. She tapped her pen thoughtfully. Or we could take a more strategic approach. Strategic how? Andrew asked. Build a bigger case, Diane explained. If this is happening to you, it's likely happening to others. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Andrew thought about this. You mean find other students who've been targeted? Exactly, Diane said. Individual complaints can be dismissed. Patterns can't. Later that night, unable to sleep, Andrew sat at his computer and began building a simple but secure website. By morning, he had created an anonymous reporting system where students could safely document incidents of bullying, harassment, or discrimination at Westlake. Do you think anyone will use it? His mom asked, peering over his shoulder at the site. Only one way to find out, Andrew replied. At school, he quietly shared the link with Louis, Zoe, and a few others he trusted. Spread the word, he told them, but keep my name out of it. Meanwhile, the robotics team faced a dilemma. With their main project destroyed and the competition just days away, they had nothing to present. We could withdraw, Mr. Reynolds suggested during a grim team meeting. No one would blame us after what happened. No, Andra said firmly. Everyone turned to look at him. We're not giving up. Andra, be realistic, Zoe said gently. We don't have time to rebuild everything. We don't need to, Andra replied, pulling out his laptop. I've been thinking about this all night. We still have the parts from our old robot, right? The one you were using before I got here. Mr. Reynolds nodded. It's in the storage closet, but it barely moves. We don't need it to move much, Andra said, opening a design program. We just need it to tell our story. For the next 3 days, the team worked non-stop. They rebuilt the old robot with a new purpose. Instead of completing the standard competition tasks, they programmed it to display a rolling presentation about their journey, from their early struggles to the destruction of their project, without naming names but telling the truth. It's not going to win, but it will be remembered, Andra told the team as they finished the final touches. The night before the competition, Andra checked the anonymous reporting site, his breath caught in his throat. In just 3 days, 17 reports had been submitted. Incidents involving not just Blake's group, but other students as well. The pattern was clear: minority students, LGBTQ+ kids, anyone different. And the school's response was consistently inadequate. He forwarded everything to Diane, who texted back immediately. This is exactly what we needed. Stay focused on tomorrow, one battle at a time. The regional robotics competition was held at a nearby college campus. Teams from 20 schools had set up booths to demonstrate their projects. Blake's team had a sleek, professionally built robot that smoothly completed all the required tasks. Their booth was decorated with school colors and professionally printed banners. The Westlake Robotics team's booth was simpler. Their rebuilt robot sat on a table, surrounded by before and after photos of their destroyed project. When judges approached, Mr. Reynolds explained their situation. We'd like to present an alternative submission, he said, gesturing to Andra. Andra stepped forward, nervous but determined. Our robot doesn't move boxes or solve mazes, he explained to the judges. Instead, it tells a story about persistence in the face of setbacks. He pressed a button, and the small robot's screen lit up with a presentation. It showed the team's journey, including images of their destroyed project, with the slow blurred but still visible. The presentation ended with a simple message: we refuse to be silenced. We rebuild. One of the judges, a woman with kind eyes, asked Andra, what inspired this project shift? Andra met her gaze steadily. When our original robot was vandalized, we could have given up. But that would have let the vandals win twice. Once when they destroyed our work, and again when they broke our spirit. We decided they don't get to win at all. Throughout the day, more and more people gathered at their booth. Other teams came to see their presentation. College students stopped to talk with them. Even local news reporters covering the event became interested in their story. Blake and his friends watched from a distance, their faces darkening as they saw the attention the robotics team was receiving. They can't prove anything, Blake muttered to his friends. My dad will make sure of it. What Blake didn't know was that Diane Lee was also at the competition, speaking quietly with parents from other schools, collecting contact information, and building a network. The chess game was advancing, pieces moving into position. By the end of the day, the judges announced the winners. Blake's team took second place, their faces showing disappointment at not winning first. When it came time for special recognitions, the head judge stepped forward. This year, we're introducing a new award for innovation and resilience, she announced. This goes to a team that demonstrated extraordinary creativity and determination in the face of unexpected challenges. Andra and his teammates looked at each other in surprise as the judge called out, Westlake High School Robotics Team. As they accepted the award, a reporter from the local newspaper asked if they could take a picture and get a few quotes for a story. Mr. Reynolds looked at Andra, silently asking if he was comfortable with the attention. Andra thought about his father, about Blake, about all the reports on his website. He nodded and stepped forward. We're just getting started, he said quietly. The morning after the robotics competition, Andra walked into Westlake High School feeling different. Students who had never acknowledged him before nodded in his direction. A few even stopped to congratulate him on the team's special award. "Dude, you're famous," Lewis said, catching up with him at his locker. He'd held up the local newspaper. There on the front page of the community section was a photo of the robotics team accepting their award, with under front and center. "Westlake Robotics Team turns vandalism into victory," Lewis read from the headline. They didn't name names, but everyone knows who trashed your robot. Andrew took the paper, scanning the article. The reporter had included quotes from him and Mr. Reynolds about overcoming obstacles, along with a brief mention of the vandalism incident, currently under investigation by school administrators. "Principal Davis is looking for you," Zoe said, appearing beside them. Her purple-streaked hair was tied back, and she looked uncharacteristically serious. "He doesn't look happy." "I bet he's not," Andrew said, folding the newspaper and tucking it into his backpack. "The school can't ignore this anymore." Principal Davis was waiting in his office, the same newspaper spread across his desk. His face was a carefully controlled mask of professionalism, but Andrew could see tension in the way he gripped his pen. "You've caused quite a stir, Andrew," the principal said, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. "I didn't write the article, sir," Andrew replied, sitting down. "No, but you spoke to the reporter without school permission. And this," he tapped the newspaper, "makes it sound like Westlake has a serious bullying problem." "Doesn't it?" Andrew asked quietly. The principal leaned forward. "Every school has occasional issues between students. The proper channels exist to address them." "I tried the proper channels," Andrew said, meeting the principal's gaze. "When our robot was destroyed and vandalized with racial slurs, you said you'd look into it. Has anything happened?" Principal Davis shifted uncomfortably. "These investigations take time. We can't rush to judgment without evidence." "I understand," Andrew said, pulling out his phone. "That's why I've been collecting evidence." He slid the phone across the desk, showing a screenshot of his documentation. 3 weeks of incidents, all reported through proper channels, all with minimal response. The principal glanced at the phone, then pushed it back toward Andrew. "This is one student's perspective. And frankly, bringing the media into a school matter was inappropriate." "I didn't bring them in," Andrew corrected him. "They were covering the robotics competition, but they seemed very interested when I mentioned I have documented evidence of ongoing harassment and the school's failure to address it." Something flickered in Principal Davis's eyes, not anger, but worry. "What exactly are you looking for here, Andrew?" Before Andrew could answer, a knock came at the door. The school secretary poked her head in. "Sorry to interrupt, but Mr. Harding is here. He's quite insistent about seeing you." The principal's face paled slightly. "Blake's father. Tell him I'll be with him shortly." After the secretary left, Principal Davis turned back to Andrew. "We'll continue this conversation later. For now, I suggest focusing on your studies and staying out of trouble." As Andrew left the office, he saw Blake's father in the waiting area, tall, expensively dressed, with the same entitled expression his son often wore. The man gave Andrew a cold look as he passed. Outside, Andrew texted his mom, "Meeting with Principal Dunn. Blake's dad showed up. Might need Diane's advice again soon." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of classes and whispered conversations. Word about the newspaper article had spread throughout the school. Some students looked at Andrew with new respect, others, particularly Blake's friends, with thinly veiled hostility. At lunch, Andrew sat with the robotics team and chess club members who had started sharing the same table. "Something big is happening," Lewis said in a low voice. "Blake got called to the principal's office right after you left." "And he didn't come back to class," added Zoe. "His friends are saying his dad is threatening to sue the newspaper for implying Blake was behind the vandalism." Andrew shook his head. "They never named him in the article." "Guilty conscience," Lewis said with a shrug. After school, Andrew stayed late to work on rebuilding their main robotics project. Now that they had recognition from the competition judges, Mr. Reynolds had secured funding from the school's emergency budget to replace the damaged parts. As Andrew worked alone in the classroom, he heard the door open. Looking up, he expected to see Mr. Reynolds or maybe Zoe. Instead, he found himself face to face with Blake. Andrew tensed, glancing around for anything he could use to defend himself if needed. But Blake looked different, not aggressive, but unsure. His usual swagger was gone. "What do you want?" Andra asked cautiously. "My dad wants to know what it'll take to make this go away," Blake said, his voice strangely hollow. "Make what go away?" "The newspaper, the rumors, all of it." Blake wouldn't meet his eyes. "He says we can pay for the robot we broke." Andra set down his tools and turned to fully face Blake. "I never said you broke our robot." "Everyone knows," Blake muttered. "And now my dad's reputation is on the line. He's on the school board. He has a business in this community." For the first time, Andra saw past Blake's privileged exterior to something else, a scared kid who'd never faced consequences before. "It's not about money," Andra said evenly. "It's about respect. It's about creating a school where everyone feels safe, no matter what they look like or where they come from." Blake finally looked up, a flash of his old anger returning. "So what, you want me expelled? Is that it?" "That's not my call," Andra replied. "But things need to change around here, and not just for me." Blake's phone buzzed. He checked it, then looked back at Andra with a strange mix of resentment and uncertainty. "My dad's waiting. This isn't over." "No," Andra agreed. "It's not." After Blake left, Andra sat back down at the workbench, his hands slightly shaky from the confrontation. He pulled out his phone and found 23 new reports on the anonymous website. Stories from students who'd faced similar treatment but had been too afraid to speak up until now. The evidence was mounting, the pieces aligning. Like in chess, sometimes you had to let your opponent think they were winning before the track closed. Andra forwarded the new reports to Diane, adding a note. "Blake's father tried to buy me off today. I think they're worried." Diane's response came quickly. "They should be. The school board meets next Tuesday. We'll be there. Time to show our hand." Outside the school windows, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the robotics lab. Andra looked at the half-rebuilt robot, then at his phone full of evidence. For the first time since arriving at Westlake, he smiled without reservation. The game was turning in his favor, and his opponents didn't even realize they'd been outplayed from the start. The weekend before the school board meeting, Andra's house became command central. Diane spread documents across the dining table while Dr. Wilson helped organize student testimonies. Andra sat cross-legged on the living room floor, sorting through printed screenshots and photos. 42 reports in total, he said, looking up at Diane, from 28 different students. Diane nodded, impressed. "That's more than I expected. And the pattern is clear: minority students, kids from lower-income families, anyone who doesn't fit the Westlake image." Dr. Wilson brought in a tray of sandwiches and set it on the coffee table. "Will these students speak at the meeting?" "Most are too scared," Andra admitted. "But 7 have agreed to come with their parents. They'll share their stories if needed." "That's brave of them," his mom said, sitting down beside him. "I'm proud of you, Andra. Your father would be too." Andra felt a lump in his throat at the mention of his dad. "I just hope it makes a difference." "It already has," Diane said, holding up the local newspaper. The front page headline read, "Westlake Parents Demand Answers. Reports of Unchecked Bullying Surface." The article detailed how multiple families had come forward following the robotics competition story, alleging a pattern of harassment and discrimination at the school. The reporter had reached out to Principal Davis, who offered only a brief statement about taking all allegations seriously. Blake's father refused to comment, Diane noted. "That's telling." "What about the school board?" Andra asked. "Will they actually listen?" "They have to," Diane replied. "This is too public now." And 3 of the 7 board members have children at other schools. They're not part of the Westlake inner circle. Monday at school was strangely quiet. Blake was absent, and his usual group of friends stayed unusually subdued. In the hallways, students whispered when Andra passed. Some looked away. Others gave him small nods of acknowledgement or even thanks. During lunch, a sophomore girl Andra didn't know approached their table. She was thin and nervous-looking, clutching her books to her chest. "Are you Andra?" she asked in a soft voice. He nodded. "I'm Tina," she said. I filed one of those reports. About Blake and his friends. They've been calling me trailer trash since freshman year because I live in the mobile home park." "I'm sorry that happened to you," Andra said. I'm coming tomorrow, she continued. To the board meeting. My mom's taking off work early. She shifted uncomfortably. I just wanted to say thanks for making it so we could finally talk about this stuff. After she left, Zoe looked at Andrew with newfound respect. You've started something big, you know that? Louis nodded in agreement. People are saying the principal might get fired, and Blake's dad might have to resign from the board. I don't care about getting anyone fired, Andrew said honestly. I just want things to change. That afternoon, Mr. Reynolds caught Andrew in the hallway. The principal wants to see you, he said quietly. And Andrew? He's not alone. Andrew felt a flutter of nervousness as he approached the principal's office. Inside, Principal Davis sat at his desk looking grim. Beside him was a woman Andrew didn't recognize, dressed in a crisp suit. Andrew, Principal Davis said, gesturing to a chair. This is Ms. Carter, the school district's attorney. Hello, Andrew, Ms. Carter said with a professional smile. I understand you've been collecting reports about alleged bullying incidents. Andrew nodded cautiously. Yes. And you created an anonymous website for students to submit these reports. That's right. Ms. Carter folded her hands on the desk. While we appreciate students taking initiative, there are proper channels for reporting concerns. Anonymous accusations can be problematic. They're not anonymous to me, Andrew replied. I know who submitted them. They're only anonymous publicly because these students are afraid of retaliation. Principal Davis cleared his throat. The point is, Andrew, tomorrow's board meeting could be difficult for everyone involved. The district would prefer to handle this internally. Andrew felt his heart beating faster, but he kept his voice steady. What does that mean exactly? Ms. Carter smiled again. It means the district is prepared to make changes. New anti-bullying protocols, diversity training for staff, perhaps even some disciplinary actions where warranted. In exchange for what? Andrew asked, already knowing the answer. In exchange for handling this matter privately, she replied, without a public confrontation at the board meeting. Andrew thought of Tina and the other students who had finally found the courage to speak up. He thought of his father, who had always taught him that justice isn't negotiable. I appreciate the offer, he said carefully. But this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been hurt by the culture at this school. I think they deserve to be heard. The principal and attorney exchanged glances. Consider it overnight, Ms. Carter suggested. This could affect your future at Westlake. As Andrew left the office, he found his mom waiting in the hallway. Diane called me, she explained. She thought you might need backup. On the drive home, Andrew told her about the meeting. They're trying to buy us off, just like Blake's dad wanted to. Dr. Wilson nodded. They're scared. The question is, what do you want to do? Andrew looked out the window at the passing neighborhoods. I want to see this through, all the way. That night, he couldn't sleep. He paced his room, rehearsing what he might say at the meeting. Around midnight, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It's Blake. We need to talk before tomorrow. Andrew stared at the message, wondering if it was some kind of trap. After a long moment, he replied, What about? The response came quickly, not over text. Meet me at the park by school. 20 minutes. Andrew knew it was risky, but his curiosity won out. He slipped out of the house, leaving a note for his mom just in case, and rode his bike to the small park near Westlake. Blake was already there, sitting alone on a bench under a streetlight. He looked up as Andrew approached, his face drawn and tired. Didn't think you'd come, Blake said. Almost didn't, Andrew replied, staying a safe distance away. What's this about? Blake ran a hand through his hair. My dad got forced off the school board today. They asked him to resign before tomorrow's meeting. He looked up at Andrew. He's furious, says you destroyed our family's reputation. Your actions did that, Andrew said, not backing down. Not me. Yeah, well, Blake looked away. He's making me transfer schools. Says Westlake is compromised now. Andrew hadn't expected this. I never asked for that. Doesn't matter, Blake said with a bitter laugh. My dad already pulled strings to get me into Ridgemont Academy, private school across town. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between them. Why did you do it? Andrew finally asked. Why target me from day one? Blake shrugged, but there was something honest in his expression for once. You were different, and you didn't seem intimidated by us. My dad always taught me that you either control the room or get controlled. Sounds lonely, Andra said. Yeah, Blake agreed quietly. Maybe it is. As they parted ways, Blake called after him. Hey, Andra. Good luck tomorrow, for what it's worth. I'm sorry about your robot. Andra nodded, unsure what to make of this unexpected apology. As he rode home under the stars, he realized that tomorrow wasn't about punishing Blake or even getting revenge. It was about creating a new future for Westlake, one where no student had to feel like an outsider. The chessboard was set. Tomorrow would be the final move. The school board meeting room was packed beyond capacity. Families lined the walls, spilled out into the hallway, and whispered among themselves as the board members took their seats at the long table up front. Andra sat in the front row between his mother and Diane, his heart hammering in his chest despite his calm exterior. There are reporters here, Louis whispered from the seat behind him. Channel 5 News and the city paper. Andra nodded but kept his eyes forward. This wasn't about publicity, it was about accountability. The board president, a serious woman with silver-streaked hair, called the meeting to order. Before we address the scheduled agenda items, we have a special presentation regarding recent concerns at Westlake High School. Principal Davis sat to the side, his usual confident demeanor replaced by stiff discomfort. Andra noticed an empty chair beside him where Blake's father would normally sit. Diane stood first, introducing herself as legal counsel for several Westlake families. She spoke clearly and directly, outlining the pattern of bullying and racial harassment that had gone unaddressed for months. She explained how Andra's documentation system had revealed the scope of the problem, with 42 incidents reported by 28 different students. This isn't about one student or one incident, Diane concluded. This is about a systemic failure to protect vulnerable students, particularly those from minority backgrounds. When it was Andra's turn to speak, he approached the microphone feeling strangely calm. The weeks of fear and anger had crystallized into a clear purpose. My name is Andra Wilson, he began. 3 months ago, I transferred to Westlake. Since then, I've experienced racial slurs, physical intimidation, and vandalism of my schoolwork. He described the destruction of the robotics project, the school's inadequate response, and his decision to document everything. As he spoke, Zoe displayed slides showing photos of the vandalized robot and screenshots of threatening messages, with names blurred to protect privacy. But I'm not here to talk about myself, Andra continued. I'm here because dozens of other students have experienced similar treatment, some for years. He gestured to the audience, where several students and parents stood up one by one. Tana stepped forward with her mother beside her. Her voice shook at first but grew stronger as she described the years of harassment she'd faced due to her family's economic status. A freshman boy talked about being shoved into lockers because of his accent. A girl from the chess club described having her hijab pulled off in the hallway. A junior explained how he'd been harassed for being gay until he pretended to have a girlfriend just to make the bullying stop. Each story added to the picture of a school where differences were punished and complaints were ignored. The board members listened in increasingly uncomfortable silence. When all the testimonies were complete, the board president leaned forward. Principal Davis, how do you respond to these allegations? Principal Davis straightened his tie. Westlake has always taken student safety seriously. However, it appears that our reporting procedures may have fallen short in some cases. We welcome the board's guidance on improving our protocols. The carefully worded non-apology made Andra's blood boil, but he remained outwardly calm. Dr. Wilson spoke next, her academic credentials adding weight to her words. As an educator myself, I understand the challenges of school administration. But when racial slurs are carved into school property and minority students don't feel safe coming to class, we've moved beyond protocols into dereliction of duty. The meeting continued for over 2 hours as board members asked questions and parents demanded action. Finally, the board president called for order. The board will need to deliberate on these serious matters, she announced. But immediate actions are clearly needed. Effective tomorrow, we'll be appointing an interim principal to oversee Westlake while we conduct a thorough investigation. Principal Davis's face went pale. Additionally, she continued, we will establish an independent task force to review all bullying complaints from the past 2 years and create new district-wide anti-harassment policies. She looked directly at Andra. We would like student representatives to serve on this task force, including those who have brought these issues to light. As the meeting adjourned, people surrounded Andra, thanking him and sharing their own stories. Reporters asked for interviews, which he politely declined, directing them instead to Diane. Outside in the cool evening air, Mr. Reynolds found Andra sitting alone on a bench. You did something remarkable in there, the teacher said, sitting beside him. We all did, Andrew replied. Those kids who spoke up, that took real courage. True, but they found that courage because of you. Mr. Reynolds smiled. The robotics team voted yesterday. They want you to be captain next year. 6 months later, Westlake High School was a different place. The interim principal, Dr. Powell, had become permanent, bringing a fresh approach that emphasized inclusion and accountability. The anti-bullying task force, with Andrew serving as student co-chair, had implemented new reporting systems and training programs for teachers. Blake had transferred as planned, but his friends remained, walking more carefully in the hallways they once ruled. Some had genuinely reflected on their behavior, others simply learned to hide their prejudices better. Either way, the open harassment had stopped. On a bright spring morning, Andrew stood in the school auditorium beside Dr. Powell, cutting a ribbon to officially open Westlake's new community center, a dedicated space where students could report concerns, find resources, or simply have a safe place to be themselves. This is your legacy, Zoe told him as they hung the final posters. You didn't just stand up for yourself, you changed the whole system. That evening, Andrew sat at home, playing chess with his mom like they used to do with his father. His phone buzzed with a news alert. The school district had just adopted the anti-bullying framework he had helped design, implementing it across all schools. Your dad would be so proud, Dr. Wilson said, watching her son's face as he read the news. You took his lessons about justice and documentation and made them your own. Andrew moved his queen across the board, setting up the final move of the game. It wasn't just about making them pay for what they did, he said thoughtfully. It was about making sure it wouldn't happen to someone else. His mom smiled. That's the difference between revenge and justice. Later, as he got ready for bed, Andrew found himself looking at his father's old chess set. He picked up the Black Knight, his dad's favorite piece. It could jump over obstacles and approach from unexpected angles. His father had always said the knight represented creative thinking in the face of powerful opposition. Andrew placed the knight on his desk next to his rebuilt robotics trophy and the framed newspaper article about the school district's new policies. The headline read, Student-Led Initiative Transforms Local Schools. He thought about Blake, about Principal Davis, about all the people who had underestimated him from the moment he arrived at Westlake. They had seen only his skin color, not the mind behind it, not the determination in his heart or the legacy of justice he carried. They had picked on the wrong kid, not because Andrew was smarter or stronger, but because he understood something they didn't. That true victory wasn't about making others lose, but about creating a world where everyone had a fair chance to win. The chess game was over, and everyone was better for it.